Welcome, everyone, to this webcast from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. My name is Danny Kuan. I am Lee Ka-shing Professor in Economics and Dean here at the school. We're broadcasting from the conference room of our Oei Tiong Ham building at the Bukit Timah campus. But in the conference room, I hope we're rapidly becoming known to many of you as our Facebook Live studio for these webinars. This afternoon's webinar launches a series to celebrate 55 years of US-Singapore bilateral relations. This webinar series is jointly organized by the Lee Kuan Yew School and the US Embassy. And over the course of this series, we will be examining the entire range of different aspects to the very strong, rich, multi-textured US-Singapore partnership. Today, the first element of this US-SG 55 webinar series, we are thankful that we get to have a panel of their excellencies, Professor Chan Heng Chee and Mr. Rafiq Mansour. Professor Chan Heng Chee is Ambassador at Large, Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She is Singapore's longest-serving ambassador to the United States on record. She is currently Global Co-Chair of the Asia Society and previously Singapore's permanent representative to the United Nations. The other panelist, Mr. Rafiq Mansour, is Chargé d'Affaires and Chief of Mission, US Embassy in Singapore. Mr. Rafiq is a true polymath. He acquired bachelor's degrees, one each in biology and in French literature, an advanced degree in national security strategy. He is the winner of numerous awards from the US State Department and has served in Deep Breath, Armenia, Libya, Algeria, Iraq, France, Italy, Russia, and Haiti. And of course, it helps that he speaks Arabic, Russian, French, Italian, and Creole. What we're going to do this afternoon is I will turn over first to Mr. Rafiq and then to Ambassador Chan for each to make opening statements. After that, the three of us will have a discussion on some of the issues that have emerged in their opening statements. Through all of this, I encourage the online audience out there on Facebook Live, please don't wait until the end of our conversation to start engaging with us, to start asking questions and making comments. I will try and leave plenty of time towards the end of this event to pose your questions to our esteemed panelists. But now, to begin, first, over to you, Your Excellency, Mr. Rafiq Mansour.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today with Professor Danny Kuan and Professor Chan to discuss the US-Singapore partnership. As Professor Chan is the longest-serving Singapore ambassador to the United States, I look forward to hearing her insights. I also want to thank Professor Kuan and the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy for working with the US Embassy in Singapore to make the series of panel discussions a reality. The US and Singapore share a long history. Our countries established diplomatic relations 55 years ago when the United States opened its embassy in Singapore. But our shared history dates back 185 years to the establishment of consular relations in 1836. Through the years, our enduring partnership has built a strong foundation for a secure, prosperous, and innovative shared future. The United States and Singapore share deep economic, security, and people-to-people ties, which future sessions of this series will cover in detail. However, allow me to give a broad overview of these various aspects of bilateral cooperation. I will start with our economic ties. US-Singapore economic ties run deep, with a foundation in the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement, the first US FTA in Asia. Since the FTA came into effect in 2004, trade between the two countries has almost doubled. The US is the largest single foreign investor in Singapore, with almost $250 billion in US dollars FDI here in Singapore. There are over 4,500 US firms registered in Singapore. The United States is Singapore's top trading partner in services. On economic matters, there are few countries in the world that are more like-minded than the United States and Singapore. Whether it is supporting free trade, valuing the rule of law, or protecting intellectual property rights, our two countries are more often than not in strong agreement. Even during the COVID-19 pandemic, which has sent the global economy into one of its worst recessions ever, the US and Singapore continue to work together to deepen economic cooperation. Recognizing the significant global tightening of credit during this economic downturn, both countries signed a memorandum of understanding last year to extend trade financing and investment support to companies in Singapore and the United States. The US and Singapore also share a deep and vital security and defense partnership, with Prime Minister Lee joining President Trump in signing the renewal of our defense MOU in 2019. We continue to work together to support the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region. We have consistently partnered to address global threats and challenges, including terrorism, transnational crime, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. For example, Singapore was the first Southeast Asian country to join the counter-ISIS campaign in 2014. We also have a standing annual counter-proliferation dialogue, which brings together experts for targeted discussions. And in 2016, we concluded a cybersecurity MOU, which deepened information sharing and cooperation on cybercrime, cyber defense, and regional capacity building. These are just a few examples of the depth and breadth of our engagement on policy issues. Our relationship is now increasingly defined by what we can do together to help other countries in the region. The most powerful example of this is the US-Singapore Third Country Training Program, TSTP. Since its start in 2012, TSTP has held more than 50 workshops on a wide variety of public policy issues like cybersecurity, trade facilitation, and intellectual property rights. The program has also trained more than 1,300 government professionals from 11 different Asian countries. Not even COVID-19 could stop our TCTP efforts as we continued our work virtually in 2020 and into 2021. But we're not stopping there. Both of our countries are working with COVAX to support global health efforts to fight COVID-19. Last week, President Biden announced the United States is purchasing 500 million doses of Pfizer vaccines, the largest ever purchase and donation of COVID-19 vaccines by a single country, and donating them to 92 low and lower middle income countries. This will jumpstart robust vaccination efforts in some of the most hard-hit and underserved communities in the world. Also, we are thrilled to be working with Singapore to address the challenges posed by climate change. Like Singapore, the United States is taking a whole-of-government approach to meeting the goal of net zero global emissions by 2050. From working to develop innovative agricultural technologies through our Agriculture Innovation Mission to leveraging the power of our financial sectors to establish quantifiable, meaningful, and measurable standards for sustainable investment projects, we are proud to have a partner like Singapore leading the way to a more sustainable future. Lastly, aside from bilateral ties that are cemented by formal agreements, the US and Singapore also share deep people-to-people ties. More than 140 Singaporean companies are currently located in the US, and more than 4,500 American companies are based in Singapore. Each year, over 4,000 Singaporeans pursue higher education in the US, and more than 1,000 Americans study in Singapore's universities. The citizens of both countries also enjoy visa-free travel between the United States and Singapore. Through these interactions, US citizens and Singaporeans enjoy a robust exchange of ideas and a mutual understanding of each other's cultures, values, and traditions. I would like to take this opportunity to speak on behalf of the tens of thousands of Americans living, studying, and working here in Singapore. We value Singapore's generous hospitality, level playing field, and boundless opportunity, and will continue contributing to our local communities as good neighbors, friends, and colleagues. For 55 years, the United States and Singapore have worked together to create an expansive and enduring relationship based on mutual economic interests, robust security and defense cooperation, and long-lasting people-to-people ties. These 55 years of partnership are just the beginning. The United States is proud of the rich history between our countries and look forward to a prosperous, shared future for many more years to come.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for the wonderful, inspiring statement. I'm going to turn over to you now, Your Excellency, Ambassador Professor Chan Heng Chee, for your opening.
Thank you very much, Danny, Professor Danny Kuan, and I'm privileged to be here with you and with the Chargé d'Affaires and Chief of Mission of the U.S. Mission in Singapore, Rafiq Mansour. You know, when I was ambassador in Washington, I would always say to American audiences that between Singapore and the United States, good bilateral relations is the norm. Bad relations is an exception. We work well with every administration, Democrat or Republican. And CDA Rafiq Mansour has just outlined the contours of a substantial and strong US-Singapore relationship, one that goes back to the mid-19th century. I would add additional highlights and some thoughts on the growing, evolving relationship. Now, let me begin by reiterating that the sustained US presence in Singapore is critical to the peace, stability, and prosperity in the region. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew openly acknowledged that the American presence in Vietnam bought Southeast Asia time to allow the countries to develop economically and to build our political institutions. The Singapore-US relationship traditionally stands on two pillars: defense and economic and trade interests. We have expanded the cooperation, as Rafiq said, to non-traditional areas and to include third country assistance. As Rafiq has given a comprehensive, broad sweep of the bilateral cooperation, I will just touch on some particular elements of the relationship. Now, the election of President Joe Biden was welcomed by the region in November 2020 after an unpredictable few years. The UK research firm YouGov did a pre-election poll in the Asia-Pacific, asking people who they wanted to win in the US presidential election. YouGov covered Indonesia, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Thailand, Philippines, Australia, and Taiwan. Singapore, of all the countries and territories, polled highest for Joe Biden as their preferred candidate. 2/3 of Singaporeans wanted Mr. Biden to be elected. We want to build the bilateral relationship further with the Biden administration. So let me mention a few areas we can work on. The United States is one of Singapore's closest defense partners. Since the MOU of 1990, we have built up the partnership. We announced our decision to purchase 4 F-35B Joint Strike Fighters in 2020, with the option to acquire 8 more. We trained in the Luke Air Base, Arizona, but will move to Ebbing Air National Guard Base at Fort Smith, Arkansas. And we have an F-15 detachment in Mountain Home and Idaho. I visited Mountain Home, and I visited the Luke Air Base. We are robust partners on counterterrorism, and in spite of the pandemic, we stood up a multilateral counterterrorism information facility, which was mentioned, in 2021 to share intelligence and provide early monitoring and analysis capabilities. We work on cybersecurity, which has been mentioned earlier, so I will not go over this again. Now, apart from the traditional areas of cooperation on defense and trade, we have signaled our interest to work on new areas such as climate change, the digital economy, and global healthcare needs, which are also on the Biden administration agenda. We believe we can move on these areas quite easily. In trade matters, we are interested in a bilateral and regional digital economic agreement with Asia-Pacific countries and the United States. As you know, Singapore has already signed digital agreements with Australia, New Zealand, and Chile. We can work together to strengthen supply chain resilience, as well as vaccine storage and distribution. We are a natural partner in this effort because of our manufacturing ecosystem and interest in preserving global supply chains, and can help to shore up US supply chains in continued semiconductor and pharmaceutical and medical supplies. We are, after all, the third largest semiconductor producer in the world after South Korea and Taiwan. We believe Singapore and the United States can collaborate on climate change by strengthening the capabilities of ASEAN countries to transition to clean energy, smart cities, and sustainable transport solutions. And the United States should work with us on the ASEAN Smart Cities Network. We note, too, that the Biden administration has placed emphasis on values in foreign policy, on democracy and human rights. We hope this policy will be handled with care and nuance. Countries in the region have different traditions and sensitivities. The last time there was a campaign to promote democracy and human rights, it was at the end of the Cold War. It carried the spirit of triumphalism, the end of history, and unfortunately came across as something akin to cultural imperialism or cultural imposition, as some analysts have commented. We had our differences, the US and Singapore, over the episode of Michael Fay. This was the exception to an otherwise excellent bilateral relationship. We hope in this era of American foreign policy, we will continue to recognize the importance of conducting relations on the basis of non-interference in domestic matters, a principle Singapore cherishes. Now, we will look forward to working with the United States to deepen its engagement with ASEAN, and we hope the United States will intensify our contacts. As you know, Singapore always speaks up for ASEAN, even as we pursue bilateral matters. When I was in Washington, I was called the ambassador of ASEAN, as well as ambassador of Singapore, because I always pitched for ASEAN. This is what Singapore does. So let us work to reschedule the US-ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting soon, and for President Biden to visit the region. Thank you.
Thank you both for wonderful opening statements, inspiring vision on the contours of what the bilateral relations have achieved, as well as being clear-eyed about some of the bumps along the way, and that we continue to need to be watchful for. Now, part of what we promised for this discussion now, before we move into the Q&A, is to see how what the both of you have outlined of U.S.-Singapore history and partnership can be brought to bear on today's challenges. And today's challenges at this point include many of the large issues that both of you have described, but I would like to bring in yet others, that we might have a full-throated discussion of how this relationship can be best leveraged to rise to the challenge. So a first set of issues I want us to talk about is the issue of populism. But I want to contextualize that properly. Populism in many of our nations, all around the world. And it's a truism in international relations practice that what one is able to achieve externally is a function of what is going on internally. So it's quite important for us to get a good sense of what's happening internally across the world in different nations. So this issue of populism, there is a narrative out there that actually ties it to the success of multilateral and bilateral relations across the world. Okay, there's a story about populism that goes roughly as follows. The rules of the game have been laid out about how nations engage with each other. This is made for a level playing field and has brought confidence to the entire world. This confidence has proceeded into first globalization and then a hyper-globalization, where markets grew exponentially. What each of us wanted to sell, we saw ever-increasing demand for. At the same time, what each of us wanted to buy became available at cheaper and cheaper prices. So these rules of the game, this multilateral rules-based system benefited everyone. But then in the last decade or so, frictions began to appear, pain points began to appear in this narrative. And these pain points had to do with how the stories that were told were that you, a developing nation across the world, obey the rules, you play by the rules of the game, you too will become prosperous. And people realized, however, that within nations, that didn't seem to be happening. Many observers within nations began to feel left behind. And because of this increasing income inequality, failure of social immobility, however you want to call it, the social fabric became frayed. And there was, in a US Western movie type imagery of the kind that I grew up on, there was tendency for people to think we need to circle the wagons. It became we, the citizens in our nation, versus you, the rest of the world. And this kind of a narrative, this populist narrative, has taken hold in many nations, including, lamentably, the US and Singapore. So the question I pose to the both of you, given the wonderful successes that each of you has described, what do we tell our citizens now in terms of how the world will continue to be a better place? Keeping to the rules-based system, keeping open to all other nations will be good for us. Perhaps I could begin with you, Mr. Rafiq.
Well, thank you for this important and timely question. Both the United States and Singapore believe in a rules-based order. And I think that this is an important part of our foreign policy approach. President Biden, I am proud to say that his first trip to a US government agency in Washington was to the State Department. And his message was that diplomacy is going to be at the heart of our foreign policy as a nation. He also reiterated the importance of reinvigorating our alliances. And I think that this is something that you will very much see in this Biden administration. the willingness and the desire to work together with our partners and allies, the realization that we are stronger thanks to our allies, the shared interests, but also the shared values in this conquest for a rules-based order. And you have just seen a full week of that in Europe, whether with the NATO, the G7, the EU. You have also seen that on his first day when he decided to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. You have seen that in the B3W, Build Back Better world. You have seen that in America's leadership to vaccine diplomacy. You have seen that in the emphasis on climate and the climate summit that President Biden has hosted virtually, and to which he invited not only Prime Minister Lee, and we're very proud of that, but also he invited the Chinese president and the Russian president. So that's the kind of leadership that you could expect from Biden's America, a country that will lead by not only by the example of its power, but by the power of its example.
Very good. Thank you very much for that wonderful, inspiring vision that you've reminded us of. These developments over the last few weeks have been truly astounding, and they really do show sort of the reality of America's presence again in the world in a very positive way. Can I turn to you, Ambassador Chan, to get your reaction to this circle of discussion?
Thank you, Danny. There were so many points you raised, very interesting point in your, in a way, opening statement question or questions, you know. And Rafiq has answered several aspects of it. I'd like to take up the issue of globalization, the rising populism, and clearly behind that is the sort of leadership that is needed. There is no doubt that, you know, in our early understanding of globalization, that it is all good, has now turned out that we were not quite accurate. Globalization has an upside and a downside. There are winners and there are losers. And because there are losers, they feel that, you know, people feel globalization hasn't done much for them. And hence populist movements come in their wake. And in the United States, you see this. And as you say, in other parts of the world, including Singapore, there are populist feelings, you know. Close the gates, don't let people in, you know, and let's try to look after ourselves. But we know a world without globalization is an impoverished world. Global trade, global movement has, in fact, created the prosperity and the standard of living that most people have enjoyed. You know, by and large, the world has, in fact, become much better off. Yes, they are still poor, but larger numbers have come out of poverty. What we need to do with globalization is to go on globalization 2.0, which is to be conscious of many of the populist concerns, you know, their jobs, you know, their futures, and political leaders must address that. In fact, I think they are trying to address that. What do you do with immigration? I think these are key questions. In the United States, it's a key question, what you do with immigration, and in Singapore, people discuss this quite a bit. And leaders that respond and try to deal with this issue sensitively will make something of it. But there certainly is no going back on globalization. We are not going to turn into autarky. You know, that's not the way to go forward for anyone. Right. Now, the point is, do we have internationalist leaders? And Rafiq has spoken of President Biden and his attempts to step up and offer leadership in the world. We need leaders who are internationalists, but who also have a humane vision of the world and who understand that inequality in the society is not a good thing. And you must try to uplift and change standards. But inequality in the world is also not tolerable. And it cannot, in fact, you cannot have a few states in League One running ahead when other states, the 191 of them, are doing so badly. So we must try to help all. Now, the pandemic has highlighted this inequality. And clearly the wealthier states are doing well. They can have the vaccines. It's not just money. You've got to have competent government, decisive government, and people must trust in government. And you must believe in science, if I may say so. You know, but then it's the vaccines. And the wealthier countries can afford vaccines. Now, G7 and the United States has now committed altogether, I think, something like 1 billion vaccine shots. So, you know, you need to do something. So, internationalist leadership is important. And President Biden is trying to offer that. But we really have to deal with the inequalities in the world. I can go on, Danny, but no, maybe I'll just stop there.
Okay. But I'm sure we'll come back to these issues, whether from my subsequent questioning or questions that are coming in. But thank you both for those really excellent statements. Some of the messages that came out of your very rich interventions included how we need to have leadership, but that leadership needs to show an inclusiveness, whether it's from within the nation or across nations. We cannot have just a small block that then determines what the rest of the world gets. And within nations, we've got to have what Heng Chi refers to as humane leaders, leaders who see how by increasing prosperity for the nation, we need to lift everyone, especially the weak and vulnerable, within all of our societies. And that's a wonderful vision to take forwards. Let me, if I may, switch gears a little bit. There's so much more to unpack here, but I want to make sure to cover something else here, which is the geopolitical challenge in this region. Okay, because here too, we need to think about all of these issues, inclusiveness, leadership. They have slightly different manifestations. So let me set this up. I was on a Chatham House panel recently, as all of us were in this collection of Zoom windows. And it's obviously Chatham House rules, so I can't say who said what, but I can report what was said. And one of the themes that came out of this quite frank discussion that involved Americans, Europeans, Asians, was someone saying that America, in terms of what was happening in this region, was forming a balancing coalition in this part of the world. And then they very quickly went on to say, but this is not a coalition to contain China's rise. This is a balancing coalition. And this is the point I want to explore with the both of you, because both of you have made statements about this. So someone else in this call then said, well, how is it a balancing coalition, but not against China, if China is the only significant nation in this part of the world that's been left out of this coalition? So what is the inclusiveness there? No matter how we dress it up, today, when we talk about this region and we say geopolitics or geopolitical challenge, whether we like it or not, many people will read these phrasings to mean US-China relations and the difficult atmosphere that we're in now on this. So I want to get the two of you to speak to this. There are many different responses on whether the United States is indeed taking action, seeking to build alliances to contain China's rise, and the well-being of Southeast Asia in that landscape. One quote that's often repeated is that the US should not ask Asian countries to choose. You may not like the results if you ask the countries here to choose. This is a phrasing we hear repeated a lot these days, but I did a bit of Google research, and actually, Heng Chi, you are reported to have said this in October 2012, 10 years ago, just as you were returning to Singapore from your term as ambassador in the US. So my two-part question first to you, and then I'm going to bring you in, Mr. Rafiq. First, did you say that? And second, how do you see things now?
I must have said it if Google says so. Yeah. And I am sure, many people in the region have said this in so many ways. My Prime Minister has said it. Don't ask us to choose. Asian countries and many countries that are also not in Asia don't want to choose because we want to be friends of both the United States and of China. Now, how do I see things going forward? It's getting harder and harder because both sides are forcing, both powers are forcing countries to choose. I think much more the United States, if I may say so, Rafiq. Certainly this rivalry is getting extremely intense and is deepening, and coalitions are being built, and really at G7 statements, there was a joint statement, but behind the joint statement, I think there were many differences from what I gather from the news reports of how China should be handled. And the Financial Times quoted President Macron, who said, the G7 should be for something, united for something, not against something. So I can understand what may have gone behind. We've seen the Quad emerge. China has built the BRI. We've seen the Quad emerge. So, it's, and the G7, and certainly President Biden came into office saying that he would like to the United States has to be firm with China and has to deal with China, but it will deal with China with a coalition of allies. So he's building that coalition. You can call it balancing act, If it's building a coalition, is it containment? Is it not containment? Sometimes you feel it's containment, but in the next breath, American officials will say, but this is not containment. So if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, it is a duck, So I think we hope it is not containment, and many of the very senior statesmen of the United States, Henry Kissinger, for one, has in fact said, I think last year, in 2019, he said, we are at the foothills of a Cold War, looking ahead, we are at the foothills. Last year, he said, we're on the mountainside. And he said, we are really moving up this year. So I think everyone feels this concern. But this is not but if you look at the relationship between the United States and China, and the United States and the Soviet Union, the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union happened at a time, there was a Cold War, when there was a very strict decoupling, literally decoupling. And the situation was very different. Today, China's economy and the economies of so many Western countries and the United States and Southeast Asia and India and Latin America, Africa is all enmeshed. They are interrelated. So it's really very difficult to talk of a Cold War in that sense, or of a serious decoupling. Yes, there is talk of technology decoupling. Maybe you can achieve something there, but even there, I am told by experts, it's not as easy, as one thinks. And so, coming back to your answer, how do I see the situation? I think it's not a good spot. And that is why countries around the world, many countries are trying to persuade the United States that there surely should be a third space where we can occupy and we can befriend both parties. My Prime Minister just said to Prime Minister Scott Morrison, You don't have to be like them, talking of relationship with China. But you cannot change them either. So you should cooperate. And the world is big enough for everyone to work in it.
Thank you, Heng-Ji. Now, Rafiq, this is an occasion to celebrate all the good things, but I also want to make sure we talk about some of the awkward things. And, in a sense, we've been here before, but we also haven't been here before. The Cold War analogy is very informative in many ways, but that was actually not necessarily greatly as much in Southeast Asia as what's happening now. And you've told us a wonderful vision of what Biden's been up to the last few weeks, building coalitions, making sure we've got inclusiveness. But on this point, what's happening in this region and US-China relations, I think it would be helpful for us to continue talking and get greater clarity. So I would like to get your reaction on this.
No, I can fully understand why this is so important, because in many ways, you're talking about the most important and consequential bilateral relationship for the rest of the world. To try to answer your question fully, I think I should address 2 points. One, what is the Biden administration for and against? And number two, a little bit more specifically about China. So my president this week said that his agenda is not against any one country, but it is for the American people. Fighting COVID-19, rebuilding our economy, reestablishing our relationships around the world with our allies and friends, and protecting our people. He said, that's my responsibility as president. So he defined what he is for. Now, President Biden and Secretary Blinken selected a very seasoned American diplomat who has spent about a quarter century working in this region to be our next assistant secretary for what we call at the State Department EAP, East Asia and Pacific Affairs. That's Ambassador Dan Crittenbrink, who up until a couple of months ago was our ambassador to Vietnam. He had his Senate confirmation hearing a couple of days ago. And allow me to share with you a couple of pertinent elements of what he said. He's talking about his priorities, and he outlined 6 priorities. I will share with you the first 2. First, he said, our top priority as a bureau, East Asia and the Pacific, this region, is to revitalize ties with allies and partners. Our network of alliances and partnerships is our greatest strategic asset, enabling us to pool our strengths to advance shared interests, deter common threats, and promote universal values, including our commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific that is rules-based and unconstrained by coercion, the peaceful resolution of disputes, freedom of navigation and overflight, and respect for human rights. Strengthening these relationships will be my top priority, he said. The second one specifically about China. He told the Senate, I support approaching the PRC from a position of strength by working with allies and partners, engaging with international organizations, standing up for our values, and investing in our diplomatic and military capabilities and the American people. The United States will counter PRC attempts to erode the international rules-based order, push back on unfair PRC trade practices, secure critical supply chains, protect sensitive US technology, and build our strength at home. We will bolster partners' capacity to resist PRC intimidation and oppose China's unlawful maritime claims. We will also cooperate with China when in our interests, such as on the climate crisis, counter narcotics, and non-proliferation. As President Biden has said, we are not looking for conflict, but welcome stiff competition and will defend U.S. interests across the board.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a very clear statement about what prospects look like going ahead. Thank you very much. The issues that both of you have touched on do indicate so many wonderful areas for collaboration, so many fruitful areas for working together. But simmering underneath this, we continue to have differences that at some level we need to celebrate, because there are many different things that work for different societies, work not so well for others. One question that's come in on the Q&A, if I may put to the both of you, is a reference to the increasing polarization politically in the United States. I mean, this is related to the populism discussion we had earlier, but the increasing polarization within the United States in the body politic. So here I'd like Rafiq to maybe speak to this, how America sees its going forwards politically in the face of this polarization. And Heng-Chi, I'd like to get you maybe to reflect on your time when in the US as a Singaporean, how you saw those wonderful years that you were there, how that compares to what many observers think of as this polarization between Democrats, Republicans, rich, poor, the coastal areas and the Midwest. So what do we make of the polarization that the observers in the audience are writing in about? Rafiq?
I think that the 2020 election showed the world and showed Americans that Americans have very different views. I believe that we derive strength from this diversity of opinion. Even within our own government, the whole concept of our government is built on checks and balances. So no one American, regardless how powerful he or she is, can rule the country with an iron fist. There is checks and balances. And we believe that this is healthy as long as the principles of democracy are preserved. And this is why, for instance, what we saw in Congress in early January, that violent attack, that was worrisome because it was not in line with American values. And this is why it was worrisome. Our way forward, and you mentioned these words, diversity and inclusion, we have to include different opinions of Americans. We have to debate. And everybody needs to feel that they have a voice and can manifest that in a peaceful fashion. This Biden administration feels particularly strongly about diversity and inclusion as part of our values. And we believe that it makes us stronger, smarter, more creative, and more innovative. And that our diversity gives us a significant competitive advantage on the world stage. And this is something that we are also trying to do within the State Department. In terms of our recruitment, in terms of our promotions, in terms of our retention, we would like to see a State Department that represents the diversity of the American people, not only for us as State Department, but also for the world. So I am confident that this will continue to be one of the priorities of the Biden administration.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Strength through diversity, having those differences in views, airing them, sharing each other's concerns, understanding one another. and then building a consensus going forwards, the consent of the governed that takes all of us forwards. Eng Chi, can I get you to reflect on this?
You just mentioned the word consensus. There's diversity of views and there's polarization. They are two very different words. And here I speak more like a political scientist, because democracy is presumed and is built upon an underlying consensus in a society. Where there is no consensus in a society, you cannot go forward. For instance, at one stage in 2021, I think Americans were concerned, and this I have to say, the one good thing about democracies is that it is self-checking, it is self-critical, and it tries to reform itself. But at one point in January, people were wondering whether a certain segment of the United States, the Republicans, would even accept the results as legitimate. And I thought that we had some sense, but I saw what has happened to Elizabeth Cheney, who stood for truth, the fact, and she hasn't been rewarded, shall we say, and so this idea that, you can have a democracy where you have two realities, facts are disputed, and the diversity this polarization produces that, is troublesome. And I think there's a lot to be worked on in the democracy. And Americans know this. I don't have to say this. I read the essays. I learn because I read these very thoughtful writers. Let me say that when I was there in the US, and that was your question, Danny, I had a great time. I was there for 16 years. And it was in the last few years that I began to see it. I can't exactly pinpoint when, maybe the last 5 years or so, I began to see the polarization or the division. And I'm told, well, if you're inviting so-and-so, this Republican to the dinner, you shouldn't invite the Democrat. So you invite moderate Republicans, moderate Democrats. So, there could be a dinner conversation. So there was that difference. And I was told by Americans in Washington, Ambassador, the Republicans today are not your grandfather's Republicans. And I'm told the Democrats are very different from the Democrats you knew. So clearly, some basic changes had taken place. And I began to see gridlock in government. It began with the check on President Clinton, gridlock. And then it became a very frequent thing. Every administration, saw gridlock days. And I think under President Trump, the gridlock was the longest. So it gets longer. I hope President Biden doesn't get a gridlock that lasts longer than what President Trump had to, endure. So this is happening, and it's not good for government. When government is gridlocked, and that is when, Rafiq, I think in democracy, for countries that are not in the established institutionalized democracies, they look and they say, what's happening? Is that democracy? Wow, why would we want that? So, and so democracy has to reform itself. But it's easier said than done. I've read so many books about how intellectuals, professors think democracy should be, reformed. But
and it's definitely not easy.
It's not easy.
Democracy is definitely not easy, but it's probably better than the alternative.
But as I said, the best thing about democracies is that they are aware of the problems, and people can talk about it and try to check it. And President Biden will try his best to do what he can. And frankly, I think he's done very well so far, domestically. He's brought out all the vaccinations, he's completed vaccines, he's got his bills, he's got the money out, he's trying to get the infrastructure bill. So he's trying to put money in the hands of people.
Our country will turn 250 years old in 5 years. And we are well aware of our imperfections. And we work on them because we are constantly striving to be a more perfect union. And that's continuous work. And democracy is not easy, as I think we have all seen. But we keep working on it.
I like how many leaders, many American leaders, speak proudly of what they refer to as our experiment in democracy, that they're constantly still trying to learn, that it's not perfect, like you say, the blemishes are out there in the open for everybody else to see, but we need to also be able to construct a narrative so that those outsiders who are even younger democracies, even more fledgling democracies, take appropriate lessons, not say, well, this is all chaos, I never want to go down that path, because there is a danger that the outside world will take that naive lesson away, and it would be wrong from the perspective of the United States. But at the same time, if I may press a little bit, given this humility, a very positive humility, do you think America should haul back on what it professes as a universality in the set of values that it tells the rest of the world? In Singapore, in Malaysia, Southeast Asia, and all of East Asia, we have suffered the ire of Americans lecturing us about values. And perhaps, the humility about how this is an experiment in democracy needs to seep into that discussion of universalism as well. Anyway, but both of you have been wonderful in your interlocutions. If I may, can I press on with some concrete question? I mean concrete literally, as in infrastructure. Okay. Now, early on, President Biden pushed through two bills, one on COVID and the other on infrastructure for the United States. And at that time, they were the two largest bills that had been introduced in the US government. But it was heartening for the rest of the world to see, because here was someone taking charge, making the nation better, bringing it, building back better. But of course now, we've also got an international initiative on infrastructure being driven by the United States and the transatlantic economies. And it self-consciously has to be set against China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is also about infrastructure. So we've got these two different visions of infrastructure. So if I may, I could get the two of you to reflect a bit on how America works with Singapore and ASEAN on this global infrastructure vision, and how it meshes with or counters, or however you want to describe it, sets itself against China's BRI vision. Perhaps I could begin with you, Rafiq.
Danny, I've been here for 2 years, and I know enough to know that the way to try to persuade Singapore or the Singaporean government of anything is not to have them make a choice between the United States and China. So let me tell you what we stand for. And you use the word humility. And that's a word that Secretary Blinken used in his Senate confirmation hearings. About his personal approach, he said it's a combination of humility and confidence. And I think that's a beautiful combination, and that also, I believe, reflects the approach of our foreign policy, humility and confidence. So I'll be candid with you. The US progress when it comes to COVID-19 in 2021 has exceeded my own personal expectations as a citizen of the United States. Candidate Joe Biden had promised 100 million vaccines in his first 100 days in office. We have far exceeded that. And I say that with a great deal of humility because we definitely had a lot of ground to cover. But here is the smart thing that I believe we're doing, is that we realize that it doesn't matter how good our progress is in the United States. That as long as not everybody is safe, no one is safe. And so Ambassador Chen, she mentioned G7, she mentioned the Quad. And as a matter of fact, the latest figures that we have is that since 2020, the G7 has committed to financing and providing 2.3 billion vaccines for the world. The United States is providing nearly half of that support and is the single largest COVID-19 vaccine donor in the world. Vaccine diplomacy is huge. And we are taking a leadership role in that.
Has it been delivered?
Not yet. Some has, but the goal is to have it all delivered by the end of 2022. And I think that's a major undertaking, because we all realize that having the vaccine is one thing. The logistical aspect of it is where many countries are struggling or finding it quite challenging. The other one that you are talking about is dollar diplomacy, infrastructure. And I'll be glad to tell you, I'm not an expert on BRI, but let me tell you about what Americans are trying to do in the B3W. It's a values-driven, high standard, and transparent infrastructure partnership led by major democracies to help narrow the $40 trillion infrastructure need in the developing world, which has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. So when you're talking $40 trillion, it's clear that no one government, no one country can do it. And it's also clear that you definitely need to rely on public-private partnerships to do that. So through B3W, Build Back Better World, the G7 and other like-minded partners will coordinate in mobilizing private sector capital in 4 areas of focus: climate, health security, digital technology, and gender equality. That's 50% of the world's population right there. It will be global in scope. So from Latin America and the Caribbean to Africa and the Indo-Pacific. And naturally, different G7 partners will have different geographic orientations, but the sum of the initiative will cover low and middle income countries across the world. The United States, we will seek to mobilize the full potential of our developmental finance tools, including the Development Finance Corporation, the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, EXIM, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and the US Trade and Development Agencies. So that's a very ambitious and badly needed global project and approach. So that's a little bit on vaccine diplomacy and infrastructure.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Eng Chi, if I may turn to you on this discussion, Singapore and ASEAN figure prominently in BRI discussion. How do you see this B3W infrastructure-focused initiative now, sort of looming in what Singapore and ASEAN must do going forwards?
Well, I think the Build Back Better World is talked about, is on paper. The money has yet, the details are not worked out yet, all right? So we'll see what the details are. Right now, BRI is what year now? I've forgotten.
2013, it was introduced in Bali.
So about 4 or 5 years, or 6 years.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is, and I heard this from one of the countries in Asia, a big country in Southeast Asia, where a politician said that, when we borrow from the World Bank and from IMF, the conditions are really very hard for us to fulfill. Labor conditions, environmental conditions. Now, Rafiq just said it's about values. It is values driven. So, I think many of these countries will say, okay, what values do you want me to implement? And so this particular politician said, it's very hard from us to borrow from World Bank and IMF because of these conditions. As a result, we don't borrow, we don't build the infrastructure. China doesn't impose these conditions, And so, you know, we borrow and we can start building. So I think that's the sort of difference. So in the G7 proposal of Build Back Better World, you know, B3 World, when you say it's values driven, there are projects you want to support, but not projects you don't want to support. So it's limited. Yes, everyone will want digital. Everyone will want health, green economy. It depends on what you mean and who gets, are they compensated? And gender equality, you know, I think depending on which countries you go to, there could be resistance, you know. And so I think, so BRI will be there and B3W will be there. And I think countries will take from both, you know.
What the two of you have said seems to me a really important sort of conjunction that I hope this series will come back to in later incarnations. Because on the one hand, Rafiq, the story that you tell has a wonderful internal coherence and consistency. We're values driven, we have high standards, this is the way ahead. And what Heng Chi has described for us is that the gritty reality of a lot of ASEAN, 10% of which still lives on less than $2 a day. We're struggling with really, with sort of bare bones infrastructure. In Singapore, we're a first world city at this point, first world country. But we're aware of how a lot of ASEAN needs to continue to be brought up. And the narratives are sort of marching right past each other. A values-driven narrative, which sounds really good, something we can all subscribe to in the abstract, and something that when China comes around and says, look, I'm going to engage in such actions that we will have a win-win outcome and a shared future, mutual benefit in the immediate next 5 years, that we run the risk of losing sight of the wonderful, longer-term values discussion that you bring to us. And we need to change that narrative. It seems to me that the US-Singapore partnership is precisely the right one to try and have that dialogue, awkward that it is, to try and craft out a new narrative that works for us in Asia.
You know, I would also add that, Rafiq, because there is another initiative that's tabled, I am sure BRI is, in fact, the Chinese are, they learn. You know, when they first brought it out, it was very quick and there were many mistakes made. And later in the second summit, they tried to make things slightly different. There's been emphasis on transparency and people asking, why don't you tender, different things. And it's got to be sustainable and emphasize sustainability. I'm sure with B3W, the competition is there. And so they have to up their game. And countries will want to borrow from both.
Okay. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. I need to sort of slowly bring it down. I mean, we've had a bracing discussion on many important issues. I wanted to sort of bring this to a conclusion, but maybe by getting from each of you sort of 2 or 3 thoughts that we want to take forwards from our very rich conversation. Heng Chi, perhaps I can begin with you.
I think the Singapore, if we are talking of Singapore and the United States, certainly, as I've said, for the last 55 years, in our engagement, we've really had a great relationship. We would like to emphasize that going forward, we hope we will continue this relationship. We understand the United States is a global power and you have to be everywhere and you can get distracted. And maybe we do not get as big a share of your attention, but we would urge you to the United States to pay attention, to work with Singapore, but also to pay attention to this region. Because ASEAN is a very important floating vote. And you have to think of it in those terms. We may be frustrating to work with, but it is very important, and it is a legitimizing vote also. So that's one thought, Secondly, I am hoping that the United States, having gone through the experience, and President Biden and his team are seasoned people. The United States always wants to do good. And by wanting to do good, sometimes it doesn't quite hit at the right things, because where you want to do good, the societies are not ready for it and are not as receptive. I'm referring to your nation-building exercises in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and you use the word humility. So I would approach values and democracy and implementation of democracy and human rights, trying to understand the societies a little bit more. I think that would be important, and I think that will help. Do I have to give you a third?
No, it's always good. So in an exam, you don't have to answer every question. Thank you very much, actually. It's so valuable and inspiring to hear from you about the things that we need to communicate on. Rafiq.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the Lee Kuan Yew School for hosting us and for helping us celebrate in a meaningful way 55 years of a very important bilateral relationship that I dare say has a regional and sometimes even global impact. And I could not have hoped for a better partner today than Professor Ambassador at Large Chan, because obviously very few people are as expert about this bilateral relationship than she is. And thank you for your distinguished service, both back in Washington and here in Singapore. I fully agree with you. This is a very, very important relationship. And this is why we actually have 24 US government agencies at the US Embassy in Singapore. 6 Department of Defense agencies, 8 law enforcement agencies, 4 agencies working on business, trade, and investment. And I am very proud of them. Thanks to them and thanks to our Singaporean partners and friends, the breadth and depth of this relationship is tremendous. And we realize that everything that we work on here has, again, a regional, sometimes even global impact. We are going from strength to strength. It is remarkable that a country the size of Singapore is actually home to about 80% of US FDI in all of ASEAN. It's remarkable that there are 4,500 US companies here. It's remarkable that half of the Singaporean government is US educated. And you are all familiar with the strength of our military relationship, but our non-military security cooperation is also growing in cyber, in counterterrorism, in counterproliferation. We are very proud of that. The United States is a Pacific country, and we will continue to grow from strength to strength in Singapore and the region because we fully comprehend its strategic significance for us, the United States, and for the world.
Thank you both, Your Excellencies. Wonderful closing statements. Thank you for such a delightful time, for being so frank and honest and open in the way that we've discussed these sometimes quite difficult issues, sometimes very happy issues. But thank you both. And thank you, the audience, for joining us this evening. We hope that you've enjoyed the session. Please join us again on Thursday, the 29th of July, same time, same place, for the next session of US-Singapore relations at 55, our shared past and future. If you're late coming on, the URLs and the Facebook links will all, of course, all be available and publicized. The second session in this 4-part series will cover even more deeply US-Singapore security ties. In the meantime, thank you all. Be safe. Have a wonderful evening. Goodbye.